by bringing together interdisciplinary researchers, educators, and community partners. TBDH seeks to expand ethical and responsible approaches to representing border stories in the digital cultural record. I'd like to extend a heartfelt thank you to everyone who has supported this event, from the Mellon Foundation, the Interdisciplinary School of Engagement at the College of Liberal Arts, the Arts Department with the exhibit opening it up for us before, the current TBDH co-PIs and fellows who have helped with making this possible, the speakers who joined us and have had a lot of different talks and presentations in their visit from Tucson, Arizona, and those that are joining us today in person and online. Thank you so much. This means a lot. Your good intentions are invaluable in making this series a truly inclusive space for dialogue. To get this started, as part of TBDH mission, we're honored today to welcome Megan Sensenay and Verónica Reyes-Escudero. Megan, Verónica, whose research exemplifies this interdisciplinary engagement with Borderlands archives and digital humanities. And today I have the honor to introduce them. So Megan, Verónica, because yesterday was Verónica is the Catherine B. Willup Head of Special Collections at the University of Arizona Libraries and co-PI of the Digital Borderlands and the Classroom Project. Her work focuses on integrating archives into undergraduate and graduate curricula, promoting archival literacy, and supporting hands-on community-engaged learning in the Borderlands. And Megan Sensenay, who is the head of the Research Engagement Department at the University of Arizona Libraries and co-PI of the Digital Borderlands and the Classroom Project. Her teaching center work supports faculty and students through digital pedagogy, data-informed humanities instruction, and collaborative classroom-based research practices. This talk it's titled Border Stories Towards Ethical and Sustainable Frameworks for Community Engagement in Borderlands Research, Curation, and Storytelling. It examines how transborder digital humanities intersects with community-engaged scholarship and archiving through reflection on processes, lessons learned, and outcomes from 2 digital humanities projects at the University of Arizona Libraries that center and amplify stories and narratives rooted in the U.S. Mexico border. Following their talk, we will have time for questions and discussion, so I encourage you to engage with their work and bring your perspectives to this conversation. Lastly, I encourage you to follow us in our social media and our website for updates, opportunities to get to know more about the projects that are happening and the events, as well as all these talks and workshops will be also available in English and Spanish for your use. And now, please join me in warmly welcoming Megan and Verónica for this talk. Some PowerPoint, right? Yes. Hi, everybody. A moment while I get myself set up here. Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you really for coming here and making time for us. And thank you, Silvia, for the invitation. We're really grateful, and we're so impressed by the amazing work that you're doing here and the many students that you've been mentoring, and I see going into the pipeline in many different directions. So I really should feel very proud of yourself. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Verónica Reyes-Escudero, and I'm the Catherine B. Willup Head of Special Collections
As Sylvia said, serving as co-PI on the Digital Borderlands initiative with my co-conspirator here, Megan, and PI on the Reclaiming the Border narrative with our campus partner, Javier Duran at the Confluencenter for Creative Inquiry. Like Megan, and in alignment with culturally relevant pedagogy, although I thought you were going first. I would like to share a bit about myself and about my career background. I was born in San Luis Rio Colorado, Sonora, and grew up between Gadsden, Arizona, and the just over 8 miles from the San Luis border. As a migrant family, we traveled every summer to the San Joaquin Valley, where my father bore the heavy sacks of cantaloupe on his back. My mother, sisters, and brothers weeded any number of vegetables and fruit fields. After receiving my MLS at the University of Pittsburgh, I started my professional career as a librarian at the 96th Street branch of the New York Public Library, right on the border of East Harlem and the Upper East Side. So I'm having trouble saying where the significant gaps in wealth met in the reading room between the teen section and the romance section of the library. From there, I worked also at the famed Greenwich Village Jefferson Market branch, which had previously served as a courthouse next to a women's detention center, where I met the actor Ben Kingsley. For any of you who are old enough to know him, he was fairly famous. He was looking for all the biographies of Diego Rivera. I'm still looking for that movie, and I don't know which one it is. Before working for the New York Public Library Central offices, serving all the branches, purchasing Spanish language books, and organizing culturally relevant events for one of the most multilingual cities in the world. Fast forward to my start at my alma mater, at the University of Arizona Libraries as liaison to the English department, and later French and Italian liaison before my transfer over to Special Collections in 2004. Because of my upbringing alone, I grew with a sincere and necessary aptitude for building trusting relationships. Still, all of these experiences harnessed, honed, and developed my cultural competence, a foundational area of expertise and competence for the Special Collections field. And so tonight I will share how all of the collections and program in Special Collections, I will share how all of these experiences have informed my approach and vision for developing the Borderlands Collections program in Special Collections and tie in our engagement with the digital humanities.
I'm going to be going back and forth a little here. So as Sylvia said, I'm Megan Sensini. I'm the head of research engagement department at the University of Arizona Libraries. And I've served in leadership roles for the Digital Borderlands initiative and Reclaiming the Border narrative initiative as well. But like Verónica, I'd like to provide a more personal introduction and tell you about my career journey. I was born and raised in a working class family in the New Jersey suburbs outside of Philadelphia. And my journey started at Bryn Mawr College, where I worked in Special Collections Library before heading to the Midwest for an LIS degree at the University of Illinois. My early focus on special collections translated into a records management and processing archivist job at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, where we were suddenly saddled the first of the institution's born digital mission critical archives. Realizing the need, I returned to Illinois for additional training in digital curation. And I ended up working as a project manager and research scientist focused on digital collections, data curation, and the digital humanities for the next 10 years. Through work on projects like Humanities Without Walls, I developed a keen interest in regionally grounded public scholarship, and I brought these interests with me when I arrived in Arizona in 2019. This picture here is my daughter's first ever view of the Sonoran Desert 7 years ago. Today, I'll be speaking about how my understanding of community engaged scholarship has evolved over the past 7 years and the lessons that we've collectively learned from running several Borderlands-focused digital humanities projects out of the university libraries.
So when I started working in special collections in 2004, I had already been at the university libraries a few years, as one of two English literature librarians specialists, where I had co-developed a required research methods course for the major in partnership with the English Department Curricular Committee and my then colleague. I had been trained in information literacy and pedagogical best practices, in addition to having been engaged in the practice of instruction in my former role as youth services librarian in New York Public, where high schoolers were dependent on the public library for their research needs. My charge in coming into special collections when I started as an assistant ranked librarian offered me lots of agency. I quickly began an assessment of our manuscript collections to identify gaps in the archive. I found that while we were well represented in Mexicana material, representation of border communities was lacking post-mid-century for the Mexican American community, and little representation of our Black, Chinese, Japanese, and other groups. The collection was strong in European-centric pioneers and settlers. However, to discuss this point would take a separate discussion. I was asked to lead strategic planning for our special collections cluster. The requirement was to submit and discuss the critical few and priority areas for the department. I saw this as an opportunity, while others may see these kinds of budget crises and stripping of services. I saw this as an opportunity to lead our small team of 4 library faculty and 3 staff in crucial discussions that I hoped would bring us all from working separately to honing our efforts toward one aim. I was sure to use the university strategic plan as a backdrop for conversations. After years of growth, I felt we were ready to have these crucial discussions as to our focus. Still, we had the hard but open conversations as to our focus. The assessment I had conducted prior, our proximity to the border, and the university's strategic plan became the driving force behind the development of the Borderlands cultural communities. This internal program, which aimed to increase research, scholarship, and creative activities in the areas of the Borderlands. Our focus became the acquisitions of material, arrangement and description, and digitization for exposure of relevant collections to the cultural communities of Southern Arizona. Specifically, the Mexican American and Mexican community. The digitization component would ensure accessibility of materials to the community. The BCC helped facilitate conversations about personal, family, and organizations' archives. And affirmed our direction in all of areas of responsibility. Identify and acquire collections related to Latino communities along the Mexico-Arizona border. Process them, digitize as appropriate, and exposing them through an enhanced web presence, and provide outreach events that disseminated information about our services. Affirming and documenting this focus allowed the institution to fill gaps identified in the initial assessment, continue building relationships with the community, and just as important, committed to our organization's resources and brought the team to fully operate as a whole. During the early development of the program, it became clear that the community recognized that our organization had committed resources for the program. They were heartened when they learned that a position was devoted to the work, hence the Borderlands curator role, to further signal our commitment. When the program was maturing, and after a particularly important archival donation, one of our donors was asked why they decided to donate their materials to special collections. In time, it takes about 2 years process to build a relationship and trust until somebody's ready to donate their materials. So he said, lo que me motivó a hacerlo, por un lado, pues le voy a ser honesto, me pareció usted una gente seria, pero el respaldo de la universidad que le estaba dando y el que alguien pueda conservar esta parte de la historia de mi familia, y me adoptó, Creo que, y la confianza que yo tengo en ustedes, en su capacidad, y que yo creo que fue una bendición para nosotros que ustedes aceptaran tener esto en su acervo. What motivated me on the one hand, I'll be honest, and you were a serious person. But the backing from the university and that someone could preserve this part of the history of my family who adopted me. And the confidence that I have in special collections and your capacity. I think it was a blessing for us that you accept to have the collection in your archive. It's not enough to hire an individual to do this work. The organization has to be committed to resourcing that commitment. It has to be clear up to what extent they are able to support the work, and the individual handling donor relationships has to be well versed in the full spectrum of the work involved, understand very well their institution's priorities, areas of commitment, as well as their limitations. They have to be very much able to manage expectations. I would argue that a high level of cultural competence plays a crucial role in handling all of these, especially the latter. Those of you working in that space, that's your superpower.
So when I first arrived at the U of A, I was hired to lead a department that was then called the Office of Digital Innovation and Stewardship. I was intrigued by the productive tensions between the terms innovation and stewardship, but I was kind of dismayed by the degree to which digital services were still being pulled together under a single departmental umbrella. In 2019, digital services no longer seemed novel enough to benefit from co-location. And I believe that academic libraries had reached a state of maturity where digital services were distributed, ubiquitous, and foundational to our work. Over the course of my first year in service, the library was undergoing an extensive remodel that included the development of Catalyst Studios. It was a technology-rich hub it's a technology-rich hub on the ground floor of our libraries, and it includes a makerspace, an AR/VR studio, a data studio, and a suite of technology-rich learning classrooms. Our inaugural digital scholarship librarian took over as the director of Catalyst Studios, and my department went several years over the course of the pandemic without a dedicated digital scholarship specialist. This marked an attrition trend during the pandemic that was really common across universities. During a pandemic hiring freeze, my department also lost its data curation librarian, geospatial data specialist, and digital preservation librarian. I say that just to recognize that all while that was occurring, we were actively building a grant portfolio that was based and focused on digital storytelling in the U.S. Mexico border, very place-based digital work. These efforts required some staffing creativity and some agility from folks like my colleague Jeff Oliver. He's our data science specialist, and he transitioned his focus from data analysis in STEM fields to learning text data mining strategies in the humanities so that we could get this done. And throughout this period, I was building toward a vision of the department that focused on providing advanced research services for independent scholars, ranging from ambitious undergraduates to seasoned faculty members. In the wake of the pandemic, the entire library engaged in a future state planning process that led to a library-wide reorganization. I was able to build out 3 units that are roughly organized around the idea of the research life cycle. The research incubator, the data cooperative, and the scholarly communication unit. When the hiring freeze lifted, I was recruited for reimagined visions of the vacant positions I mentioned. And our services have become more robust and resilient over the past several years. I now have 2 library faculty dedicated to different aspects of digital scholarship, and a geospatial specialist who's keen to engage in interdisciplinary mapping projects. We've also enhanced our staffing support for data science, research data management, and digital publishing through a mix of hiring, reskilling, and portfolio realignment. Since then, I've been focused on working with each service in my unit to build out more programmatic service models shaped by multi-year plans and regular assessment. As I look around my department now, I think the biggest service areas that I would still like to address focus on community engaged research, qualitative research support, and research impact, which I'll discuss a little bit more after we introduce our digital humanities projects.
So, as the Borderlands Cultural Communities Program matured, family, businesses, organizations, as well as faculty partners working on community engaged scholarships started connecting with us, seeking advice on the possibility of donating their paper, projects, and or seeking consultation on how to best care for their materials. Through many one-on-one consultations and outreach events like community digitization days and many cafecitos, I learned that and lunch too, not just café, but lunch too. I learned that there was a strong desire from community organizations, largely NGOs and or cultural centers, to set up archives. This makes sense in particular for those organizations that are identity-based because they are the best situated to fully leverage their connections with the community they endeavor to represent. Consultation services have been something that we've been offering for many years, although we haven't codified it in our department. Through this process, we've learned that oftentimes the desire is there, but the organization or individuals often lack the infrastructure. For those organizations whose vision is to truly manage their own archive, many consultations followed. In all cases during these consultations, we center choice, honor their wishes, and follow their lead, while at the same time being transparent about the challenges they'll want to address, sharing our established infrastructure and advising on their own potential and making recommendations within their capacity. A pivotal point on our development of the Borderlands Collections program came when I started work on the documented border. The documented border, an open access digital archive, is an interdisciplinary effort whose goal is to advance understanding and awareness of the U.S. Mexico borderlands and its peoples during a period of unprecedented societal change. The archive focuses on untold and silent stories and events about the transnational region. The Documented Border Archive draws from the University of Arizona Library Special Collections Borderlands collections, but also acquires and makes accessible oral histories and materials that broadens our understanding of the U.S. Mexico border. The project was generously funded by the Confluencenter for Creative Inquiry that I mentioned earlier. The SEED grant allowed us to experiment with post-custodial principles, but also in innovative ways in which to support scholarly work by our faculty colleagues while being in alignment with what Special Collections was endeavoring to do, which was to bring in a wider representation and awareness of the U.S. Mexico border into the archives for study, teaching, and research. Currently, the archive has 4 collections. I'm not going to go into them, but the first 2 were Celeste Gonzalez de Bustamante and Jenny Melly's oral histories of reporters or journalists who report along the border under threats of violence, and the other was Professor Lawrence Geib's sketches of Operation Streamline proceedings. That was not his artwork to sketch, but that was sort of an art of necessity because cameras weren't allowed into the court system, so he was able to sketch and bring those images out. To get to this point, Celeste and I had already been working quite closely in developing curricular experiences in the archives for her journalism students as she was developing a Transborder journalistic experience course. A historian and journalist herself, she saw the benefit of having students delve into the archives to center and experience contextual evidence as they learn to report on the border. Interestingly, it was evident that we were also in practice of culturally relevant pedagogy as a basis during her class visits. Students in her class who were from the region could offer understanding of some of the archival materials I brought out for them, or situate them given their own lived experience. I saw a confidence in them when they found to share their knowledge of place and time while holding evidentiary material as they develop their news stories. To this point, one of our partnerships for a course led to a showcase of a mini documentary the students produced called Another Side of the Border. This became the inspiration for the documented border. To be clear, despite our close relationship and our experience working together, when we started conversations about the online project, we had to be sure to slow down, consider all of the implications. We needed to ensure alignment with our mutual goals, to be clear on resources needed, establish clear roles for everyone who would ultimately be involved in the project. We had to slow down, make time for as many conversations to come to a clear understanding. Otherwise, the project would fail. We had probably around 20 people around the table when we first started kickstarting the project. Being a reciprocal partner doesn't mean that either party is small. We established that both are strong, and leveraging those strengths when necessary and desired is sometimes the best option. To build capacity in our community, we invited the community archives that I mentioned earlier to our own professional development sessions, free of charge. Consulted with them while training graduate students to work with them, and others wanted to let us know that their efforts were focused on building a museum, for instance, and wanted us to step in on the archives side of the effort. One similar opportunity was with the Arizona Queer Archives. For years, we had been in consultative relationship with their graduate students who worked with the founder. I lost my place. With our founder, Jamie Lee. So she and I met after many months of exploring and establishing reciprocal willingness and ability for both organizations to experiment and forge into something not before done as far as we knew. We established an agreement in which both parties leveraged our strengths. One had the infrastructure with which to house, provide arrangement and description, manage access through various library management systems, and manage access to the physical collections in the reading room, as well as using materials in classroom instruction, for instance, and in addition to preserve the physical materials. Professor Jamie Lee then would continue developing digital collections through their own stewarded digital collections program, and would serve as consultant for curatorial questions.
So I want to tell you a little bit about a follow-on project called the Digital Borderlands. The Digital Borderlands project was born at the intersection of digital humanities, public scholarship, and community engaged research, much like Transborder DH, which I consider to be a sister initiative. When our dean, Sean Sutton, first approached me about preparing a grant proposal for the Mellon Foundation in the vein of University of Calgary's developing a research platform for 21st century scholars, the primary goal was to leverage a seed grant model to develop new library services. We wanted to enhance campus-wide collaborations and reposition the library within the contemporary research enterprise. I had just completed an assessment of another seed grant initiative through the University of Illinois called Humanities Without Walls. That project had sought to activate cross-institutional research collaborations among Big Ten scholars in humanities through a suite of Grand Challenges grants related to the theme of the global Midwest. Collectively, the awarded project surfaced a range of rich, nuanced, and culturally diverse narratives about a region of the United States that is often considered rather homogeneous. Homogeneous at best and boring at worst, perhaps. Over the course of interviewing each of the Global Midwest project teams, I had grown increasingly convinced that regional storytelling was one of the most important contributions that land-grant universities can make within the mission of public extension and engagement. I already knew about Veronica's prior work as the Borderlands curator for Special Collections and the documented border project that she and her collaborators had brought to fruition. As a model, I think it exemplified the kind of storytelling that library research seed grants could facilitate. Moreover, the university had recently announced the creation of a border lab within its strategic plan, which represented a commitment from the university to prioritize and fund regional research efforts. Tying the initiative to strategic commitments and our HSI status could garner support and buy-in across the university. And I had no doubt that a single thematic call under the banner of Digital Borderlands would garner sufficient inter, multi, and transdisciplinary interest to draw a competitive pool of applications. With Verónica on board, a project was taking shape that blended Sean Nardine's scholarly commitments to open access, my interest in expanding library services around data and digital storytelling, and her curatorial expertise on the U.S. Mexico border. Where Calgary had focused on providing direct technical support to awardees, Arizona emphasized archival engagement and developed an education and consultation research support model with lightly scaffolded provisions for technical infrastructure. We relied on a host tool called Domain of One's Own and a selection of low barrier digital applications like story maps. In line with our commitment to open access and public scholarship, we agreed that all seed grants would be required to produce a final digital product freely available on the open web. We welcomed varied approaches to storytelling that might include digital exhibitions, thematic scholarly research collections, mapping, scrolly telling, and audiovisual products like oral histories and documentaries. We also introduced a more community-engaged element to our call for proposals. We prioritized research projects that included community partners as collaborators, while emphasizing the importance of well-established, mutually beneficial, and reciprocal relationships in our review criteria. In turn, projects were able to situate themselves along a spectrum from scholarship for the public to scholarship with the public. Mellon was pleased with our approach, and we received notification that we had been awarded $750,000 to pursue the project in March of 2020. Just as the pandemic was spreading through North America and borders were closing under a state of emergency, and the summer of 2020 was also marked by a racial reckoning across the United States and bighorn wildfires at home in Tucson. These circumstances made the work of the project feel more daunting and also more urgent. So against the backdrop of the cultural moment we were in, we hired a project coordinator, we released the call for proposals, and we ran our first round of proposal development workshops to help prospective applicants connect with library consultants and prepare project plans that were significant, feasible, and consistent with the terms of the grant. Over 2 rounds of funding, we were able to award 8 research teams $60,000 each for 12-month projects that could either function as standalone efforts or serve as prototypes for large-scale initiatives. Projects included explorations of disability, fair housing, historical race and identity formation, cultural autonomy in the face of displacement, climate justice, migrant incarceration, civic forensics, and recovery, and place-based cultural storytelling. And these 8 projects engaged with 22 different community partners, ranging from grassroots activist organizations, community centers, cultural heritage organizations, and informal community groups. This list represents a network with significant variance in terms of resources, needs, and goals. I'd love to do a deeper dive into each of the 8 projects and the partner institutions, but for the sake of time, I'll direct you to our project website to learn more. And I'll also share that we launched a Digital Borderlands podcast just a few months ago that illustrates how library services were integrated into funded projects. And you can learn more about the projects that way too. At the conclusion of the projects, we conducted a series of interviews with awardees and library consultants to better understand how libraries, universities, and funding agencies can adequately support these kinds of complex collaborative projects that are situated in that intersection of digital humanities and public scholarship and community engaged research. Regarding technical infrastructure, our findings validated many of the outcomes from Calgary. Calgary's cohort of awardees identified data curation and sharing, analytics and visualization, metadata services, digitization, rights management and dissemination, and collaborative spaces as their principal needs. Among the awardees we interviewed, the most likely services identified for ongoing and future use were special collections, Catalyst Studios, data visualization, and geospatial data support. When asked which research services they'd like to see the libraries prioritize, the top priorities that emerged were web hosting, design and development support, special collections. They want us to keep funding all of these collections that are so great. Data visualization and data literacy, metadata support for research projects, and more support for networked services through coordinated communications, outreach, and partnerships. Compared with Calgary, the strong emphasis on special collections among our awardees may partially be a result of our having centered and prioritized collection-driven research in our call for proposals. Though metadata services and digitization represent a shared priority and perhaps a shared challenge. Catalyst Studios represents the University of Arizona's most collaborative spaces for research and engagement, suggesting the ongoing importance of the library as a place-based entity. Awardees emphasized data literacy, data visualization, and geospatial data, which actively informed my hiring and developed priorities within the UNET. So among other things, this resulted in a collaborative effort with our central IT department to launch a locally hosted geospatial data repository. Unfortunately, support for web hosting and design has remained a challenge for Arizona. And we'll have a little bit more to say about that in a bit. The final priority identified by awardees, I think, casts the initiative as a highly socio-technical endeavor. It requires significant coordination across and beyond the university campus. Increasingly, academic institutions are focusing on strengthening public scholarship and community engaged research, but I'm not fully convinced that we have done the work to understand and differentiate how public scholarship and community engaged research complement and compete with long established academic norms and expectations. Awardees' experiences indicate the need to initiate conversations with scholars in the fields and representatives from our research offices who focus on things like research compliance, research integrity, broader impacts, to better determine how we can accommodate a variety of research methods for cross-disciplinary and community-engaged partnerships. In our work with Digital Borderlands scholars, we emphasized the importance of multiple deliverables for multiple audiences. This was well demonstrated in project outputs, but it also created sticking points for scholars who wanted to honor the needs of their community partnerships while still operating within the norms and expectations of their field. Awardees encountered barriers and challenges around research design and protocols, IRB applications, and managing the 3 primary resources in any project, which are time, funding, and labor. Time and funding are perhaps the biggest considerations for universities and funders who are looking to incentivize public scholarship and community engaged research. Building and sustaining community partnerships occurs over long time frames, as Verónica demonstrated. And it's an essential element for building trust, for building mutually beneficial and reciprocal relationships. Shortchanging the labor of relationship building risks extractive research practices that can and do directly harm community members. They may also result in reputational harm for scholars and academic institutions. But scholars are also operating under time constraints associated with the tenure clock and grant performance periods. So finding ways to harmonize those incongruent timescales is essential for supporting community engaged research. A related issue that many scholars raised relates to how money flows from funders to universities, circulates inside institutions, and makes its way back out to community partners. Many of our business practices, which are designed for things like transparency and accountability, end up stymieing perfectly ethical and appropriate distributions of research funds. Combined, these issues associated with time and money can create a feeling of structural exclusion for community engaged research. Oh, thank you.
By the time the Ford Foundation approached us via their project archivist, I had recently been hired as department head for special collections. I moved from Borderlands curator to department head. The invitation, and that was like 2019, right before the pandemic. The invitation was to apply to be the archival partner to the Ford Foundation's Reclaiming the Border Narrative initiative. They had already funded over 40 subgrantees. Reclaiming the Border Narrative was this is from their site. Reclaiming the Border Narrative was an effort to penetrate and shape the national attention on migration and the United States-Mexico border by supporting authentic storytelling by affected communities on the cultures and sociopolitical dynamics that comprise the region. Funding will enable immigrant rights advocates, artists, writers, and organizations to work over a period of 3 years to organize and preserve stories reflecting the dignity and truth of border communities, connecting and empowering them to center their own narrative on their terms and in their voices. This is from the Ford Foundation. They would bring in an archival partner to provide access to and preserve the grantees' projects. Along with the Confluencenter for Creative Inquiry, we were selected to serve in this capacity to create a community-led archive. We divided our proposal into 4 phases: relationship building, development of the archive, activation, and sustainability of the digital archive. When this happened, it was late 2020. It was late 2020 and into 2021, right in the midst of the pandemic and racial reckoning, as well as our own internal constant shifts and pivots as a public service site whose work required us to be on site, as well as several vacancies across the libraries. I recognized from the outset that this initiative carried deep cultural, historical, and ethical importance. As archival partner, we felt a strong responsibility to ensure its success by honoring the voices of border communities and building an archive that reflects their narrative on their own terms. As an administrator, I felt a deep sense of responsibility to make it a successful, exploratory, didactic, and fulfilling experience while meeting mutual expectations. On the one hand, I was clear about our limitations, and on the other, I felt a great deal of tolerance for experimentation, a great deal of facility with thinking about what was essential and purposeful, and was very clear about our aims and clear-eyed about what we would need out of this grant if we were to accept their invitation to apply for the position as archival partner to this very purposeful and substantially committed initiative from Ford. And given our past experience, I had a great deal of confidence in our staff, as this was, in a way, an acknowledgement to our years of accumulative work in this space. What seemed tricky at the time, one, that the initiative seemed very mirroring our documented border project, and that the invitation came not directly to Special Collections, but through another center. I saw, however, an opportunity to leverage what we had built. First, based on years of development in the various areas for a robust digital humanities project, as I described before, I knew what would be required of us and what our current limitations were. And second, we were in a position to leverage our campus partners' strengths and expertise. Each of the previous experiences I've mentioned here informed our approach. A strong foundation was set on which we could move forward if we chose. Invaluable were the support of our then Vice Dean Sarah Shreves and my co-conspirator here, Megan. And of course, everybody who contributed, and this was so many people, too many to count. The approaches we undertook with reclaiming the border narrative were based on our practice in areas of exploration I hoped we would undertake to further inform future approaches that could prove beneficial to both community and our own practice. With the wherewithal and gumption to experiment and with a purposeful aim, we therefore sought to build on our mission of broadening understanding of the U.S. Mexico borderlands through primary sources by amplifying the voices whose lives are centered along the border. The approach we proposed for our Mellon-funded Digital Borderlands initiative informed our approach for reclaiming the border narrative. We also built on our University of Arizona Library's efforts to support digital scholarship on the borderlands. We were keen to explore ways in which we could build maintainable and sustainable infrastructure to support digital scholarship projects for our constituents. So, and Megan will speak more about this, to develop a post-custodial digital-only archive, we proposed to employ Reclaim Hosting's domain of one's own package, which allowed us to explore the shared hosting method as a long-term solution for supporting community archives and continue to build expertise and understanding the product's long-term hosting service capabilities. Reclaim launched in 2013 with the goal of providing students domains and web hosting that they would own and control so that they could go away with it once they were done with school. They had developed migration services that supported student ownership to take their content with them after graduation. The same principles of ownership and control that made the solution attractive for student portfolios needed a strong potential for infrastructure support for institutions and aligned with our seeking platforms that reinforced post-custodial services or archives. As Megan will share, we found it wasn't a viable option for long-term servicing. In short, we offered the following options to the grantees in terms of adding to the digital archive. They weren't forced. It was not a requirement. That we made that very clear. And Ford was very happy to abide by that. To offer a digital platform they could use entirely on their own, so they would just choose their own thing. To offer support for adding content to the platform of their choice, or to accept donation of their product to be included in a digital archive we would build in Special Collections. Through employment of Reclaim's hosting, we found that that portion was unsustainable. While the platform is built for individuals to easily use out of the box, we found that the grantees who were less technically savvy or uninterested and not directly funded for dissemination of their projects through a digital platform required significant and unsustainable amount of guidance to build their own platforms. You have to think that these are folks who are doing the work out there of social justice. So, that's the work they were focused on, not on building a repository. They weren't just uninterested doing the they weren't, I think I'll stop there.
I can talk about it for a second. I actually was That was the workshop where I was talking about it.
That's okay.
So I will share that within Reclaiming the Border narrative, about 70% of the awardees participated, which was pretty high number. It was opt-in to archive their work. My gosh, I'm blanking.
Oh, no, that's okay. I just
now.
thought you were going to talk about how it didn't work. It basically was unsustainable because it needed a lot of work.
Reclaim that topic.
Reclaim.
was-
You weren't.
yeah.
Yeah.
But I did want to just share how many participants did end up working with us. The bulk of those who did work with us ended up wanting to work through the archives to have us manage their digital archives for them, which I think is a really nice sign of trust and the amount of engagement that we had with them to bring them to the point where they wanted to do that. About 6 decided to build their own, and we provided training and consultation support for that. And then we captured projects that were done out on the open web externally. I think we had about 10 or 11 of those. So what I do want to talk about is some of the lessons learned from doing both of these projects simultaneously. It taught us a lot about providing library support for digitally focused community archives and community engaged research. And if we could share any of our hard-won lessons with the Transborder DH community, we would emphasize the need to build a shared vocabulary, manage expectations for staff support and project outcomes, understand the support and the infrastructure necessary to implement large-scale projects and where you are in terms of readiness for that, and re-envision what preservation and sustainability can and should look like. Even within the libraries, we often found that we needed to work across departments to clarify and articulate the differences between things like library created digital archives and collections on one hand, and thematic scholarly research collections on the other. We would encounter these divergent needs and practices, especially for the latter, around metadata, where metadata might be used more like a qualitative analysis tool rather than a tool for standardization and access and interoperability, just making it discoverable out of the way. Within UAL, we are continuing to explore strategies for consultancy and referral on digital scholarship projects that use special collections materials or are intended for special collections acquisition. While our work on reclaiming the border narrative was fundamentally archival, we still spent significant time building a shared vocabulary with our awardees around the nuance of archival practices and the choices that are inherent in a post-custodial approach. So we would walk through the pros and cons of different options and work with them to understand the limitations and the affordances of digital archiving. That required a pretty high level of engagement in training and consultations for web hosting, an exhibition tool called Omeka, and then creating metadata to describe everything that's in their collections. Even with generous funding from Ford and Mellon foundations, we would often witness a gap between the outcomes that awardees would imagine in their heads and what was feasible within the scope of our own staffing and our infrastructure. As archivists and librarians, we are deeply aware of the sustainability trade-offs associated with bespoke projects and high production values. Awardees were often frustrated by the limitations of out-of-the-box solutions, but they didn't have access to the additional resources required for even pretty minimal customization. They were often surprised by the degree of time and labor and expertise that was required for even very modest digital projects. Y'all probably know about this because you work with Sylvia now. Both projects relied on really significant institutional staffing and infrastructure and buy-in. And while we were fortunate to have built much of the necessary infrastructure and staffing expertise over a period of years, flexible, sustainable web hosting has just remained such a challenge for us and a lot of other institutions. We had piloted domain of one's own in the libraries, and we agreed that with our staffing, we didn't have sufficient staffing to provide ongoing support beyond the scale of a few rounded projects. So this leaves a gap among our enterprise solutions for complex digital scholarship, multi-institutional and community engaged initiatives. We're not quite sure sort of the space that we're able to host those in right now. And in light of these experiences, we're starting to explore a more bounded training model using minimal computing strategies through static GitHub pages and the collection builder framework to start to facilitate digital scholarship and public scholarship and community engaged research, as well as post-custodial community archiving. My final observation for me is that relate to our experiences with sustainability and preservation. We were really careful to differentiate between the two. We were prioritizing what we want to sustain over time and what we want to preserve by capturing a moment in time. In both projects, our aim was to nourish and cultivate relationships and collaborations that would continue to evolve beyond the life of the grant project. We were eager to see this evolution reflected in the digital representations of projects that we supported as well. We hoped that the Digital Borderlands projects and the RBN archives would continue to grow and to change over time. And in that sense, we focused on sustaining relationships and preserving content. Our approach to content preservation varied across projects. Where we accessioned materials and made long-term stewardship commitments, we will continue to preserve items and collections indefinitely. That's the job of the libraries. For digital scholarship projects and more arm's length post-custodial archives, we opt for snapshot approaches using web archiving as a tool. We captured what the project looked like in its final funded form and offered complimentary hosting for another 5-year period before turning responsibility back to awardees to either independently maintain or sunset their projects. This is a pretty pragmatic solution. It accounts for our own institutional capacity over the long term. And in this fashion, we can focus on sustaining relationships, building new collaborations, and preserve selectively while we continue the work of documenting the border.
So as we close today, I want us to return to the question that has quietly shaped everything we've been discussing. So how do we move forward responsibly? Borderlands research, curation, and storytelling are never neutral acts. They are shaped by power, by history, by access, and by absence. And so our next steps must be intentional. We must move toward ethical and sustainable frameworks for community engagement, frameworks that are not extractional, not symbolic, not temporary, but reciprocal and enduring. Ethical engagement asks us to reconsider authorship and authority. Who tells the story? Who benefits from it? Who is invited into the room? And who is still standing outside? Sustainable engagement requires that we build relationships that last beyond a single grant cycle, a single exhibition, a single publication. It means accountability. It means shared decision-making. It means investing in trust over visibility. The borderlands, whether geographic, cultural, linguistic, or disciplinary, demands that we sit with complexity. They ask us to resist simplification. They challenge us to honor lived experience as knowledge, not as anecdote. As we continue this work, let us commit to co-creation rather than consultation, collaboration rather than extraction, and stewardship rather than ownership. Even if they're aspirational, And we do this work in shifting cultural, political, and economic landscape. Policies change, funding landscapes fluctuate. We're certainly experiencing that. Narratives are contested. We're experiencing that. Communities experience new pressures and new forms of vulnerability. In this moment, the responsibility of researchers, curators, and storytellers is not only to document change, but to respond with integrity and care. Continuing this work means staying adaptable without losing our values. It means strengthening cross-sector partnerships. It means advocating for resources that support long-term community relationships. And it means being brave enough to examine our own institutional practices, to ask where we can do better, and to act on those answers. While there is necessary vulnerability to this, I hope I've given you a few examples to draw on. As you all start or continue your own work in this sphere, I hope this gathering can be a point of momentum. Maybe we leave with a clear resolve, intention, and at least one partnership to pursue. We hope that design thinking, that design thinking exercise that Megan took you through yesterday, for those of you who were there, will work to plant the seeds you need or give you a bit of courage. Let's continue to press on and be the light in our corner of the world. The work continues, and I look forward to continuing it along all of you. Thank you. Oh, no, not yet. Oh, yes, we did.
And we sit, take questions.
What did you do?
Yeah, so, well, once again, thank you so much. We have, since we started late, we can have a couple of time for questions. The people also online, if you wanna share your comments, questions through the chat or unmute yourself. And we have now the space open for comments, questions. Most of the class, it's taking the Latino Digital Humanities. So a lot of what you saw, it's big projects. So feel free to jump in as a student asking for the work that you're thinking of doing or would like to hear more about that.
In your guys' line of work, I'm curious, what's sort of like the biggest ethical issues that you guys have ran into?
I think, thankfully, we haven't experienced it, but the worry always is of extractive research. But in the way that we laid out the plan, the proposals with both the Mellon grant and the Ford Foundation grant, it was very much clear-eyed about that. We had researchers in the Digital Borderlands grant, for instance, if they were going to work with community partners, we asked that they had already had an established relationship. So that signaled, right, that this was long-term standing relationship and it wasn't going to be in just trying to make a relationship to get a grant. So, I mean, generally that's what we talk about a lot in the field. Is one thing. You wanna add something?
Yeah, that like never let the funding opportunity be the catalyst for building the relationship. Build the relationship and then decide together where to go after funding. I think that is, getting your ducks in a row and doing it in the right order. One of the things that I think is interesting is when we're working with communities that, can be harmed by having their content publicly on the web. I think one of the biggest tensions ethically that we experience as librarians is we really believe in open access for all and information should be free. And we really believe in privacy and not harming people. So I think we're very careful to balance care for privacy and care for openness. And that shows up in really interesting ways. Sometimes even down to really small discussions, like in one of the Digital Borderlands projects, we had one of the incarcerated asylum seekers was drawing really cool art while they were incarcerated. And one of them was like a satirical picture of Mickey Mouse in an ICE detention center, and really wanted to share it and post it online. And we were having these conversations like, Disney's really litigious. Do we want to bring Disney's attention to this person who is already in a situation that is really challenged? And so those conversations we kind of sit down and have. And so that, I think, for me is something that we're really careful with, because you know, as much as we want to make things open and freely available and have people have as much information as possible, only as long as it's not going to harm, you know, human beings.
So early on, maybe the openness helped me think about, or it brought to my forefront that early on, it was a sort of a difference in values in terms of our professional values of open, like you're saying. But then with our Indigenous communities, there were things that we held in our collections that weren't necessarily, maybe they were given permission 50 years ago, but right now it wouldn't be appropriate to open. So it's not, maybe it's ethics, but it's also a very difference in values. And so we've moved now to the point where we mostly understand in the profession. But that's something that we contend with quite a bit, and just setting up, like, we have guidelines in terms of how to use materials, worked across the university to make sure that we're all, you know, in alignment with that. Because material is open, but it's up to the researcher to understand that just because it's open doesn't mean that they would use it.
One thing I'll share for all of you if you're doing projects is there's another Mellon-funded project called Humetrics HSS. And it's about how do you sort of do values-driven scholarship, and how do you ground your scholarship in your values, and it helps you build frameworks. And we did, especially for reclaiming the border narrative, several workshops and iterations about what are our values, how are we grounding in them, how do we talk to awardees, how do we center that in making decisions as, you know, challenging things come up, challenging topics. And I think doing that work, which took a little bit, but it was really helpful to sort of bring ourselves to the table and really make that the center of the work. Because then, you know, when ethical things come up, you're like, well, you know, this is the framework that we're operating in, and we will make hard choices and not put stuff up online or do keep things closed out of respect for sovereignty, because that's what we care about.
One of the results of that was the discussion we had with Ford, where we were not going to, you know, Ford invested a lot of funding, not only for us, but for all the grantees. And despite that, they understood that we would not require them to work with us in the digital archive. So, you know, I forget how we put it, but it was like putting the relationship over the technology,
The mandator.
the requirement. So it's really helpful. I think I talked a lot about slowing down yesterday. And I know that in academia, we want to sort of forge forward, and in many industries really, but if we're doing this kind of work, you really need to know when to slow down. If you're thinking one way or the other, just slow down and have a conversation. Like I said, with my partner Celeste, we knew each other, but we still had to really come to an understanding over many, many conversations. Like, don't worry about slowing things down. It'll come out better.
Great.
In the far back.
I have a question. Two questions, but I think they're related. I'm sorry, I missed earlier presentation because we might have talked about the architecture of where your how materials will be collected and used. Did a project with my students we use the Smithsonian Learning Lab. They have an architecture where you can kind of create narratives and stories and other materials. Then what architecture are your participants using? Then how are the archives functioning with new accessibility requirements that public universities have? This
Title two.
yeah, like I teach art, and so it's almost impossible to teach an art history class online because you can't take roll of fruit and discuss painting. So
Yeah.
how are you all handling captions and materials and visual descriptions?
Yeah, I'll partly answer the second question. I have to say that it was great working with board. They were in anticipation maybe, but they were very clear that we needed to make that whatever we built had to be accessible. So we worked with our DRC, our Disability Resource Center, to ensure that whatever we were building was going to be accessible.
Your staff that does that work?
So that
Your staff that does that work? 'Cause I know like faculty, there's no one that doesn't be able to do it all themselves.
So the Disability Resource Center supported the person that we did hire, a web designer. So that helped because we had sort of the staffing. It wasn't a staffing that we had already in special collections. So they advised, and then the web designer implemented.
Yeah, and we had written the Disability Research Center representative into the grant, so she had a formal role for being the advisor to to make sure that all was in line. And this is actually pre-Title II, so what was required then is not what would be required necessarily come April. In terms of you're asking like what kinds of tools we were using for doing the storytelling?
Yeah, or going forward with Title II, since it's an enormous project
Yeah,
of time and labor. It's a labor mission.
it's a significant labor mission, and I still don't believe that they understand how labor intensive the mandate is. So my understanding, or at least the way we're operating, and by they I mean like anybody really understands how labor intensive the mandate is.
Because we couldn't use, that's all materials our Title II successful, we couldn't even use them for teaching.
Right.
Future.
So in the archive space, it's really interesting because there is a carve out for what's archived in Title II, but they don't necessarily mean archives the way we mean archives. And so that's been our biggest question in working with our Office of General Counsel and DRC is figuring out exactly where we fit into that archival carve out. I am under the impression with the way that we're approaching this, and I would say Arizona is approaching it differently. Like every university seems to be taking a different interpretation and tack on this. Is like all of our web resources have to be accessible. All of our stuff that's publicly up online, we need to make accessible. We are doing a lot of sort of takedown notices, accessibility notices, or if anything is found to be not accessible, this is the process to let us know so we can remediate it. And so a lot of our work, just given the crazy millions of individual items that we have, is more about this is our remediation plan. This is how we're doing it. If you need it now, we will remediate it as quickly as possible. But we just don't have the labor to do that remediation immediately. And so our whole entire attitude is as long as we're operating in good faith, in terms of what we create moving forward, we're going to have to do it ourselves, just like the faculty. I mean, we are faculty. So as we create projects, we have to do our own accessibility checks. We're doing a lot of training on like How do you do web accessibility checks? How do you think about what that's going to look like? How do you auto-generate alt tags? Like there's some work around like using AI to like create your alt tags for you, whether that's good or not. I see your face. But yeah, like how do you try to operate in good faith is sort of where we are. And then how do you create the conditions for remediation when it's an immediate need so that nobody has to wonder how to get it remediated if it's not quite right.
But we're all
We have a question from Anna Cab. She's saying, with big projects about digital humanities, how do you go about choosing the main topic? And she's sort of going into how there's a lot of broadness in the specific subject she's been looking into, and she wants to know how exactly to dive into specific topics.
That's from a student.
Okay, I'll try to answer that. I mean, like some of you we've been talking to, really try to hone in on something that you're interested in, that is going to keep your curiosity, your learn your research chops, something that's really going to be your thing. That's how I would go about it. All these things are actually not just that we thought about them, it was driven from something else, right? So research that somebody was doing already because they're journalists and they were trying to investigate the issues that reporters along the border are dealing with, threats of violence when they're working. So it's all really, it's gonna have to be something that you are interested in. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think from the perspective of a student choosing a project to commit to for like a capstone project or a thesis, I think the thing that is the hardest is your idea is going to be bigger than what you're feasibly able to do in the time that you are going to be a student. And so like have the big idea, because that's where you're like enthusiastic and energetic about, and then keep paring it back a little bit, because the big idea is probably a 10-year project and you might have a 6-month project on your hands. And so I think by having the thing that you're interested in, that usually is the start of like the big idea. And then so like what is the narrowest thing that would be an original contribution within that big idea that you're excited about or angry about or have a feeling about? I think getting scope, especially when you're new to doing this work, is the absolute hardest thing. I think topics, there's so many things to be interested in, like finding topics that are interesting is endless. Finding topics that are feasible, I think, is really tricky. And if you have access to people who have done similar work before and who can like say, just a little bit of back and forth around how long would this take? Is this a 1-person project or is this a 10-person project? I think that's the biggest, trickiest thing when you're new to the field.
And there are out there paring down exercises that would help you. Like, I don't have it in front of me and I don't do that work anymore, teaching students. But usually there's a worksheet, you put in your big idea, and then it helps you to kind of just pare down. Okay, so there are 5 things that I would need to do in order to accomplish this big thing. What is one of those things that I can build on or start with and then build on that?
They removed it.
Okay.
I have 2. So first, can you talk about your grant writing process? Did you both co-author? Did you hire out? Mostly curious about how you compiled. Was there some sort of prototype? I see you smiling, but what did that look like? And then second, is this something that you also incorporated in teaching students, sort of this process of getting funding and what grants for them look like?
So one of the things I didn't talk about at my time in Illinois is I worked at a research center and I drank from the fire hose with a mentor who was the director of that research center about how to write grants. And so I had a lot of mentorship through my 20s and into my early 30s, writing institutional scaled grants that would run from like $200,000 to $5 million. That kind of exposure, I was very lucky to have. At one point when I worked at the research center, I would write like 10 grants in a year, which is crazy. And so I had a lot of practice. I do some workshops because of that experience with folks around how to think about writing grants, how to do grant storytelling, because it is a storytelling exercise with a very, very specific audience, and how to think about the different pieces and components of a grant as interconnected. Because I think one of the things that's really tricky is people try to farm out bits of the grant, but the intellectual work of those bits is actually how you make your grant make sense. So I am not a proponent of asking your business office to do your budget for you. I think the budget is connected to the intellectual work of the narrative. And so pretending like they can somehow be delegated, I think it's a thing people do all the time, but I think it's a missed opportunity. Because I think your schedule of completion, your statement of significance and impact, and your budget should all be talking to each other, and you should be able to interconnect the narrative to the budget, to the schedule of completion in order for it to be truly feasible. So our grant writing process, we wrote it together. Certainly Digital Borderlands, we wrote together, it was me, you, and Sean. Reclaiming the border narrative, we had our Confluencenter partners that we wrote with as well. But we took full ownership of every piece of it. The point at which we had our budget office help us was some details, like what is the ARE right now? Like,
What's the salary?
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think it was an angel sent from heaven when Megan came on board, because we were talking about this earlier, how Megan is very systematic and I'm very intuitive. So I can do the storytelling, and I was so grateful because I knew from past experience that we needed to make sure that as we were writing our grant, we were looking at the budget and looking at the time of completion. But frankly, I didn't know the language for that at the time, you know. And so when Megan came and gave us some structure, we were able to kind of, you know, I would write certain sections, and then Megan would work on the budget. Actually, Megan worked on the budget a lot. But you know, she was making sure that things were in alignment with the story and what we needed. So as I said in my talk, like I knew what we needed. I knew we needed this position and that position, and then but also, you know, in iterating as we were writing, I'm sure that another hadn't thought of something, so it would come out. That's why it's so good to, especially if you're working with community members, that you're actually doing that together, not just sort of trying it and then giving them a pass over it. You really should be talking through it. It's fun. It's like you brainstorm and then you come up with, oh, actually we could hire a blah, 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 you know?
Yeah.
So yeah, it's very important to write it together.
And I think it doesn't feel good to be pulled into a grant that's already fully formed. Getting in on the ground floor and making sure everybody is aligned and can have a shared vision will create a project that goes well. I've been on projects where it's like, oh, well, we'll just write so-and-so in, and then so-and-so finds out that they're on this project, like, what? So, like, that is no good. So yeah, I think anybody who's gonna participate in the grant in any form needs to be at the table to write it. With the exception of if you're gonna hire in, and you don't know who you're gonna hire, but you can write a job description and advertise for it. I think that's probably the one exception I would give to that, because, you know, we didn't know, and they know what they're getting into because they're replying to a PD, a position description, right?
There's right now, there's some organizations that are offering small seed grants for student projects. I'm gonna share that because that helps start with the writing, right, where you share, like you even describe your project for funding, not for an audience, and it's a different approach. I think Christina had a question, right?
I did. What kind of reactions did you have from the community when you guys finally finished a project, or what kind of like feeling was there when you guys finally finished?
I can talk about the symposium for reclaiming the border narrative. So part of that big celebration that we talked about yesterday was a symposium and then a launch. The symposium was by invitation only. It was all the grantees were invited. And then we invited particular community members who had been working with us in a variety of ways. Man, their excitement.
Additional funders.
Oh yeah, Ford invited additional local funders. But as far as your question in terms of the community response, it was almost like a culmination of the work. Culmination sounds like the end, right? But meaning the culmination of a lot of years of work, and our donors saw that. The community members who are elders, the invited speakers, Luis Alberto Urrea and Maria, journalist, Maria Hinojosa, they saw that too. So it was just really rewarding. Super rewarding to have them be part of it, and see they were so proud, and they're like, we gotta keep doing this, and they actually wanted other conferences and things like that. That wasn't part of the scope, but yeah, I mean, there was a lot of excitement about it, both at the symposium and then at the launch.
The launch was a party.
The launch was a party.
It was great.
And that's what, Ford understood and wanted, and we were great to have that, so yeah, thanks for asking that.
I think the celebration moments are really important, and I don't always think in higher ed we do a great job of pausing to both reflect and to celebrate and be grateful. And so building that in intentionally, I think is really good. And making sure the community has opportunities either to come to campus or that we bring things to them. Like we've done, oh gosh, I'm trying to think, what was the events? It was an RBN event, but it wasn't the symposium.
The Frontery Forums.
The Frontery Forums, yeah.
Yeah, we did those actually early on. They were online because of the pandemic. We had planned to do them in person, but they were great. They were actually really well attended. And then we did a final Frontery Forum at a community center, ballroom actually, but sort of a community center. And that, so that community members could come. There's a thing about, like, I've always been very much about bringing them on campus because I want people to understand that it's their campus. They can come. It's a public institution. And so, just so that building that sense of belonging and whatnot. But it's also sometimes, okay to go into our spaces in the community because it's easier sometimes, or just because it's, a better venue. And just to change it up a little bit. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we're on time. Well, we're not. Let's thank again Megan and Verónica for sharing all of your amazing work. And I'm just gonna close to thank them for sharing all. It's many, many years that they have been working on it. And to everyone that joined us today online and in person, this is the last of our final talks. We had different border scholars from different perspectives, transnational, and we ended with the U.S. Mexico border. The conversation doesn't end here. We hope this can continue in the future. Next semester, we're ending up with the symposium where we will hear more about Transborder Borderlands initiatives across Latin America and the Caribbean and here in the United States. So that will be a great conversation too. Thank you again for being part of this growing community of scholars, students, and practitioners exploring Borderlands digital humanities. Once again, thanks to the Mellon Foundation, to UT San Antonio, to the co-PIs that are online, the fellows that have been amazing helping to make this possible. And I wish you to have a great evening. Feel free to grab some of the snacks that are here outside. And if you want to talk to them privately, we have a couple of minutes for that. But thank you all and have a good rest of the day.